and this one particularly on our representation review and the next steps in relation to this. Thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to Dale and Ben. Look forward to your advice and thoughts as we go through this. I'll hand it over to staff to introduce us into this briefing. Thank you. Steffi.
Cool. Kia ora koutou. This is the next session on the representation review as we go through the process. So the purpose of this session is to discuss possible representation arrangement options that staff have worked up based on what we've heard from elected members, councillors, and through the preliminary community engagement that we undertook. And also just to discuss the next steps that we have to meet under current legislation. And there's also a slide in there around the new legislation that is being proposed. So when I wrote the slides, the bill hadn't been introduced into the House yet, but since as of yesterday it has, so I'm sure there will be some discussions around that as well. So that is the slide around the bill that has been introduced into the House. It was introduced yesterday. As advised last time, we're still expecting a select committee process in June and then enactment of the bill in late July. That remains the same. As we noted last time, the enactment is still likely to coincide with the due date to resolve the initial proposal. So under the current legislation, Council needs to resolve its initial proposal by 31st of July this year. And the enactment is also end of July this year. However, now that the bill has been introduced, we have been able to review it. And once the bill is enacted, during what they call a transitional period, which in the bill is noted to be between the day after Royal Assent and 6th of September, Council will have an option to rescind its decision to establish a Māori ward. Of course, we cannot give you any advice on when the date of Royal Assent will be, because that will be up to central government. Oh, if I go back, maybe one note that I made in my notes here is, so there is a likelihood that councils, and that we can't fully pinpoint that, but there's a likelihood that council under current legislation will have to resolve its initial representation proposal. Then the bill will get enacted shortly thereafter, and then council will have the option to either continue or rescind its decision on the Māori ward establishment. So I just wanted to make that sequence quite clear that that may happen that way, may.
Are we anticipating making a submission to the Select Committee? Is that, I'm not sure we've had a discussion about that, but presumably that's something we would be looking to do? And what would be the process for that?
So that will be as part of the Select Committee process. And we've had indication from the Mayor that she would like us to do so. So we've started the process of reviewing the bill, because that was the first step, and then figuring out when that process will take place and submitting then. But it would go through councillors in some way before it was sent to central government. Is there anything to add?
No, that's correct.
Can I just also check in on if we don't rescind, we're still looking at holding a referendum at the following election. Is that correct?
So I did include some background slides because I anticipated that this question may come up, but I didn't know that we were definitely going to discuss the bill. So there are two options for council. Option one is the one you are referring to. So council has the option to just continue with the Māori ward establishment. But under the bill is quite clear, then council would be required to conduct a referendum or a poll at the next election, at the 2025 election. So it would mean that the Māori ward would be in place, somebody would be elected into that vacancy, but then the future of that ward councillor seat is then determined by the poll, basically. Yep. Mhm. Cool. I'll go back. Sorry about that. So in terms of what we have heard so far, we've heard from the community that the majority agree that the existing arrangements are fair and representative. And a further, so that was 74% agreed, and a further 61% agree that the arrangements work well. So the overwhelming majority support the status quo. The majority of the submitters also supported, if you remember, we had two concepts that we provided during the engagement. They supported concept 1 or 2, which outlined minimal changes to the status quo, but suggested how we could include the Māori ward into the status quo quite easily. And 63% supported that. So that is also quite high. And the majority supported retaining the current councillor to appointment structure. And then at the last session with you, we also heard that you were quite supportive of retaining the status quo as much as possible with including the Māori ward and making minimal adjustments if possible. So what we heard from you at the 23rd of April briefing is that you indicated an interest for us to explore adjusting the ward boundaries at Te Horo and Emerald Glen. That was also feedback that was received over the last couple of years from members of the community, and that you preferred concept 2, which was the concept to replace one district-wide councillor with a Māori ward councillor. And then you also suggested that we look into how the councillor to community board appointment structure could be structured so it's equitable and fair, and actually looks at the workload to spread that evenly and fair amongst councillors. So based on that, we've worked up some options, and first off, we wanted to start with boundaries. So in terms of boundaries, what we have heard from councillors and the community in terms of leaving the status quo as much as we can, but making those adjustments where the community and elected members felt that the adjustments needed to be made. There are two main adjustments. One is, as you can see, around Te Horo, and the other one around Emerald Glen. The adjustment around Emerald Glen, can everyone see that up there? Yeah, it's a little bit far down, sorry, I didn't take that into account. So in terms of the adjustment at Paikakiriki, Raumati and the Paraparaumu ward there, the red circle at the bottom, what is suggested in this picture is that it's brought back to the arrangements that were in place before the last representation review. It's not fully back to that, so it's only the Emerald Glen bit that's back to the 2021 or pre-2021 arrangements. There were some discussions during the last representation review around the north of Paikakiriki Raumati to adjust that. The suggestion here, the proposal, is not to touch that and leave that as it currently is, but to include all of the mesh blocks around Emerald Glen, the Emerald Glen road, back into the Paikakiriki Raumati ward.
So just to confirm, that's all the houses in that area?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. And also to add, so that adjustment would be compliant based on the statistical data, would be compliant with the fair representation, the plus minus 10% rule prescribed in legislation. So that's the first bit. The second bit is the circle at the top, and that's around Te Horo. And what is suggested there is that the boundary line is moved south, and actually to a point that was suggested during the last representation review. So the final proposal in the 2021 representation review suggested that the boundary line be moved south of Te Hapua Road, And this aligns with that proposal, and it also aligns with the qualitative findings during the 2021 representation review that suggested that those mesh blocks identify with Te Horo, and Te Horo identifies with Ōtaki. So therefore that's brought back into the Ōtaki ward, and all of the communities of interest are kept together rather than split apart. Here is a more detailed flipped map. So the current boundary is going right down Te Horo Beach Road. The suggestion is that it's moved south, and then I have another map that's even more detailed. So can you see how it's moved past Te Hapua Road there? It's north of Te Kowhai Road, but south of Te Hapua Road. That is the suggestion. I have to mention at this point that this is not fully compliant with the plus minus 10% rule, but it does mean that all of the communities everyone in those communities of interest that belong to Te Horo or feel like they belong to Te Horo are kept together. Hence why that's been brought up on the screen.
There was, at the last representation review, Steffi, there was a gentleman who was quite vocal about always thinking he was Waipanai, and he is very close to that area. I don't know if you remember him, but I don't remember his name either, but he was very vocal about exactly where he was.
Okay.
Maybe we could look at including him.
Are you giving him to me?
No.
Do you want to?
Keeping him with us. I mean, it might mean you just have to shift that sort of straight line boundary closer up to Hapua. I don't remember where he was, but he was very vocal.
We haven't, I vaguely recall, we haven't looked at his submission, but we can dig that up ahead of the council report so that we understand where he sits in terms of the proposed boundaries.
Despite Councillor Comrade Coe asserting the rights of the People's Democratic Republic of Te Horo, how much chat has there been with Te Horo? See, since Te Horo's been part of Waikanai, I have to say the engagement through the Waikanai Community Board has been incredibly positive with the community. Yeah, they've given them lots of money, which they were suffering from severe neglect prior. So I know there has long been the community of interest has been north, but that's partly because that's where it's been politically. So I would be interested to see that the people of Te Horo are happy with this, because from the people I discussed, what they wanted was the line just to go a little bit onto the other side of School Road, because there were people on one side of the road that were in Waikanai, and on the other side of the road were in Ōtaki. It didn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. So just to cover off the other side of the road, but they were talking about including those people coming south rather than the whole thing shifting north. So I don't know if there is substantial Te Horo feedback.
So in terms of the preliminary engagement that was undertaken as part of this representation review, there wasn't any overwhelming feedback in relation to that. There were a couple of comments around Te Horo belonging to Ōtaki, but not specific roads or anything. The qualitative results that came through in the 2021 representation review, there was a lot of engagement with that area. And also, once council passes its initial representation arrangement, there will be another submission period. So there will be an opportunity for the community to submit specifically on that, and also in relation to specific roads. So that will then, if council were to pass this option or another option, then they can provide feedback. Is that an answer? Yeah.
Is George's name, is it?
Cool. So in relation to this boundary, because it's not fully compliant with the plus minus 10% rule, it wouldn't align with legislation. No, I should say that differently. It still aligns with legislation because council is able to make this decision, but it's not fully compliant with the fair representation rule. So it would have to be referred to the LGC for a final decision, and council would have to include a clear rationale as to why they're making this decision anyway.
Is that quite much?
That is the next slide.
Can I-
So,
Cam's
If
got
you
a
don't-
question.
yeah. Not necessarily a question, but just Councillor Wilson, just with your, are we formal or informal? Is it Nigel or Councillor Wilson? Certainly when the election happened, there was a whole lot of Te Horo people that got their papers and went, what the F? You know, why can I hurt? I think that has changed slightly as I've got used to it, but there's still certainly the feedback that I've received is that people still associate Te Horo with Otaki. And in terms of the engagement, I think Michael's been doing a magnificent job in being vocal and out there and getting people in. And so if he actually ended up being in the Otaki area, I'd welcome him with open arms to our board.
absolutely.
Just to add to what Steffi said in the conversation on this point, so those that were around the table during the last representation review will remember that we proposed these very similar boundary changes at both the initial proposal and at the final proposal. So it did come out of that early qualitative feedback and then through the consultation. The reason why the boundaries changed was that the LGC, when they looked at the model, were concerned about the fair representation rule, the plus or minus 10%. So, but they took. We had some very different models. We had a small wards model, which had more wards. So they took that model because the numbers worked when you combined the small wards that were geographically next to each other, which meant that the boundary changes were lost. I think it's fair to say that the timeframes would have meant that they didn't have the time to consider it in the way that councils around the table did, both in the initial proposal and the final proposal. But I share that because it is a risk that if there's appeal or an objection, which there may well be, that a similar tweak gets made by the LGC.
Martin, did you have a question?
I sort of did, but I actually realised I was back to front on some information. But I just wanted to express the importance of keeping Te Horo together as one unit. That to me is now a community of significance. They've proven that, and that sort of thing there as well. I was going to say, hey, look, with all the developments going up in Otaki, the numbers will push. Whereas what I was saying was that's actually going to make that worse with regards to the representation side of things. But I think backing it up with the community of a bit more background as to why we need to keep Te Horo together, I think would be quite important.
So in terms of the numbers, on the screen is the population data. The population data is based on the 2023, thank you. 2023 population data provided by Statistics New Zealand. And as you can see, Otaki ward would be slightly outside of the plus minus 10% fair representation requirement. It's not extremely significant, but it is slightly out. So it would have to be referred to the LGC.
Mr. Chair, can I just ask for a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
We've got 4,930 people on the Māori ward. On the Māori roll. I'm picking that's what that number's from.
Yes.
With regards to that, yet we know there's 14,500 people that identify as Māori on the Kapiti Coast. I'm picking there could be a significant amount of people, maybe, that might decide to change over to the Māori role in relation to this. And I would pick that a lot of them might come from the Otaki area. At what point would we know is there a point where we can access that number, or is that something that we're only going to find out down this end of the process per se, and then we'll deal with it then, sort of thing? Because that could take care of your underrepresentation number, but would that be something that will sort of come out in the wash right at the end of the process with regards to maybe going back to the
So I can talk about what the guidance from the Local Government Commission has been, and then I may pass over to Dale and Ben. The advice from the Local Government Commission is to take one set of data and to stick with it until the end and not move over with other data. And people on the electoral rolls can also switch over to the Māori electoral roll up to 3 months before the election, so that would be well past us finishing our representation review. So if Dale would like to add something there. Oh,
If you can just,
Yep.
yeah,
Cool.
just got the red
got it,
light
he's
now.
right.
You, no, you were right. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So we must use the latest population estimates. These are at 30th of June 2023, which are based on the 2018 census. We are unable to use the 2023 census because in the format that we need is not available yet, which is really unfortunate. So we're working on quite old data, but the law requires us to use this, whether we choose to, we must do it. I think that's the first thing. So we cannot vary from that. So we can't look at the end of the process, what's our latest figures. We can't do that. These are it. So we must work on that. The second thing is we're working on Maori electoral population, not Maori electors. So there's a difference there. So we're working on Maori electoral population and general electoral population, which are provided by the Department of Stats. And it is based on the number of electors on the Maori and general roll, but it is not electors, it's population, which includes those under 18.
Just a quick question about the implication for Waikanai, because we're going to have to go to the commission. Is it possible that we will lose a member?
So do you mean a councillor?
Yes.
In terms of that, the population data that you can see up on the screen is for 2 councillors for
Right.
the Waikanai ward, and it's compliant with the fair representation arrangements. So no, that's not the proposal that we would pass. And obviously, staff cannot predetermine what the local government commission will decide, but that part is compliant.
Right. Okay.
Substantially
Sorry, Shelley.
Yes, settle down, Nigel.
Shelley.
At what point would Otaki get the opportunity to have a second ward councillor, being underrepresented and with the growth that is projected in Otaki, which is huge? We're projected to double our population nearly.
This is your opportunity. Every representation review, you must start with what's the optimum number of councillors is best for this district. So we're settling on 10, or could be settling on 10, we could go to 11 or 12. So this is your opportunity that's the very first thing you look at. Well, what's the best number? And we're trying to do a minimal change, so we're looking at perhaps retaining it at 10. But yes, at any stage, at any representation review, and you can do them minimum 3 years, but you can maximum 6 years. So it's that opportunity that you can review the number of councillors in total and therefore the number per ward.
So we can put that to this representation review that we would like another councillor.
You can put it there, that would increase the total number to 11.
No, within the 10.
Well, but then you'd have to comply with your wards and your plus or minus 10%, which is not likely to do. It's likely to go outside of that if you add another councillor. That's correct. And we've taken, well, if we take one off for your Māori ward, yeah, that leaves 2. Yes, you've got 2 that you can, if you do not wish to have district-wide, it's another principle. Well, now is the opportunity to make any suggestions like that before council lands on its initial proposal for the end of July. Steffi. Yes.
Yes, Steffi.
Sorry, did you want to make a comment at this point, Shelley, if you're raising something in terms of a thing you'd like to be considered?
Well, I think it could be considered that we have more representation. We've got a big area and we've got a growing community, so. Yeah.
So just I know Mark and Sarah have got some comments they want to add into this. Can I just clarify these, the figures that are here? How was I going to say this? Sorry? Does that include the boundary changes that you're suggesting?
Yes, it does. So the boundary changes we're suggesting at Emerald Glen and Te Horo that I just talked through. So in relation
is
to what
including
Shelley has said, it's not as simple as just adding a 2 where there's a 1. We'd have to move boundaries again, so it's then in alignment with the fair representation arrangements if you're keeping the number of councillors at the same number. So it means significant movements of boundaries, as in move, I would say, significantly into the Waikanae ward.
To get your population to plus or minus 10.
So the 8,500 is based on the last census, not the most current one, the one before that. So
That's
the
correct.
population would have grown since then.
That's correct, but we are forced to use these. That's the issue. Yeah.
All right, Sarah.
Oh, look, I just wondered, does Councillor Rock, does everyone around the table understand the plus or minus 10% rule? Perhaps it would be worth, okay. So in terms of the numbers, if we wanted, working with this data set and these boundaries, if we wanted to increase the number of Otaki General Ward councillors, we'd have to double the Parapara Umu, double the Waikanae to make the numbers work. So that's where it's, you're looking at a much greater number of councillors. It's not an easy change to make. Yeah, I think the argument, if you were to put this proposal forward for the initial proposal, what you would argue is that engagement data suggests that typically Otaki are underrepresented, and therefore it's important to have one ward councillor. That's more important than the 11.32% being slightly outside the usual plus or minus 10% rule.
Mr. Wilson, Nigel.
Well, I know Waikanae has the lowest population per member ratio, but people in Waikanae don't live as long as the rest of the district, so perhaps that's fair. I wondered about the 50, by taking 1,500 people, which is the Te Horo population, not the electors. I'm not quite sure what percentage of those are electors, probably a significant majority of them, I think. But taking those 1,500 out of Waikanae and putting them into Otaki, it looks to me like we've created an issue that wasn't there before. And so I'm just wondering what the justification for doing that was. Emerald Glen I understand, because, but unless there was a significant uprising from Comrade Coe and the pitchfork people of Aotearoa who really, really want to go north to Horowhenua south, then I'm not quite sure why we would validate the change. Not quite sure that all that seems to do is just throw everything out of kilter. I'm not quite sure what the reasoning for that would be, unless there's a demand for it.
So in terms of, I think this set of data may be helpful. This is the data based on the 2023 census that, as Dale has said, we are forced to use because more up-to-date data is not available for us to use in that format. Based on that data, if we were to make no boundary changes at all at either Emerald Glen or Te Horo, this is what the data would look like. So you are right, it's about not quite 1,500, 1,200 people that at the Te Horo, those Te Horo mesh blocks that would be moved. So if the boundaries were left as they are, every ward would be compliant with the fair representation. The rationale for discussing those changes is because it has come up during the 2021 representation review quite strongly, and it also was discussed by councillors during representation review sessions, hence why staff have gone away and worked out those options so we could present those to you today. but it is up to councillors to decide to not move boundaries at all, and that would be compliant.
And the other one too is, do they take into, when they do a representation review, or review of our review, do they take into account the electors per member as opposed to population per member? So at the moment, if that's based on population, right, but if you look at electors per member, you would probably find somewhere like Waikanae, for instance, has a high older population, that the electors per member is probably quite a bit higher. So the ratios would be different, and I don't know whether that's a factor or not. Or do we provide them with that kind of information to give some context around our decisions?
No, they don't look at electors, they look at the population per elector. That's your fair representation, that each elected member represents about the same number of people.
Can I just jump in you asked about the reasoning for why we would make a change. So just to bring it up a level. So when a council is asked to do a representation review, there are a number of, as you know, a number of factors you have to consider, and there's a hierarchy of things to take into account. So number one is communities of interest. Plus or minus 10% falls below that. So if it's for you to decide what is more important and whether Te Horo should sit with Otaki or the boundary should stay as it is. In the previous representation review, the justification was that the communities of interest came first. That justified being slightly non-compliant with the plus or minus 10% rule. So just wanted to mention that in terms of rationale and thinking and how you approach that.
Okay, I think there's a couple of other questions. I just want to welcome those who've come online. Apologies for the problems with our live stream this afternoon, but welcome. Liz.
Yeah, look, a couple of random comments. I think as a Te Horoan, whatever the right word is, I think we do identify more with Otaki because we live in a rural area. We have rural problems, like water tanks and septic tanks and all that sort of stuff, as opposed to town centre type issues. I think we identify more with those, more sort of sparsely populated rural areas. I don't think it hurts to add to the Otaki population because then it pushes us more towards potentially having 2 representatives from Otaki. So I think that's probably a good thing. And finally, just in regards to Otaki representation, you've got to remember we currently have 3 elected, 3 councillors from Otaki. And I'm not sure what difference it actually makes. Like if you had 2 Otaki councillors, you'd still only probably have 1 that was assigned to the community board. So I'm not sure what practical difference it makes. And district-wide councillors have to live somewhere. We don't live in no man's land, and so I think part of your representation is covered by that. And as Otaki grows, it's more likely there's going to be, district-wide councillors, I guess, come from that ward. So I don't think it's a major issue really, that the number of people elected members for Otaki.
Yeah, crikey, Charlie, last election cycle, half the table lived in Otaki, so we had to do something about it. Crikey. But no, look, and I'll stand to be corrected by other previous councillors in the room, but generally we couldn't fix the Waikanae 2 councillor problem, and that was a severe problem. And we didn't really want to adjust the ward boundaries either, but that's what so when we sent it off to or when it got pushed back against, it was taken out of our hands with regards to the boundaries. So I'm thinking this time around we can put more stronger onus on the boundary aspect with regards to the communities of interest as such, where we weren't really able to do that last time. It was more about getting the second Waikanae ward councillor in there because of the big discrepancy in the numbers around that one as such.
Great. Thank you. You want to continue, Steffi?
Yep. So that brings us, we've discussed the boundary changes. That brings us to the options in terms of the numbers around the council table. And there are 2 options that we are presenting. Option 1 aligns with concept 2 in the engagement collateral and would set the structure at 10 councillors and the mayor, and also the same number of community board members. And then one of the district-wide councillors would be replaced with the Māori ward councillor to allow for the number to stay the same. The reason that we also included option 2 is because in terms of the population data and the boundaries and everything else, that also works with exactly the same boundaries. So we just wanted to bring that to councillors' attention so you know that this is an option. And option 2 is to increase the number of councillors around the table by 1, and simply includes the Māori ward councillor as an addition to the current structure. And this is why we included that as well, because in terms of boundary changes and in terms of community board appointments and everything, everything remains the same, and all of the data we've provided is exactly the same. So it's quite easy to just add that into the mix for consideration.
Before we move on to the next part, was any consideration given last time, because I wasn't part of your review, to broaden the expanse of Raumati so that Raumati Paikokariki had 2 councillors and the Paraparaumu ward had 2 councillors? So at the moment, the person who's the Paikokariki Raumati ward member, who I know quite well actually, has geographically a huge area to cover in terms of, because there's Queen Elizabeth Park in between as well. So if you take the whole geographical area, but yeah, so I just wondered if any thought was given to including more of Parapara, like for the general election. I think the line is Kapiti Road, isn't it? To Mana, wherever the Mana electorate
Yes, it is.
falls. Yeah. So there is an electoral boundary there now. So if some consideration was given to using that as a boundary, and then see how those population numbers run out, and then you would have 2 and 2. Just a thought.
So I think we'd have to go back and look at those specifics, but I recall we did look at the electoral boundaries and thinking about which boundaries were appropriate. One of the issues with, we tinkered with the Raumati, like between Paikokariki Raumati and Paraparaumu, because that right there at the cusp, it's a dense area, so that was a way of aligning communities of interest along the most appropriate streets, while making the various factors work. I think one of the issues we ran into was the size of Paikokariki being small, and the need to give voice to, to have that as a ward. And if you move the boundary, so I'm not sure I entirely caught your question, but if you were to look at moving Raumati into Paraparaumu, say.
I was thinking, So just pushing the boundary further north.
Yeah. I think the issue would have been around communities of interest and where people identify most closely.
Okay, no, that's good.
Nigel, can I ask a question? We did have a presenter at Public Forum last week who talked about the idea of running one district-wide ward and having no general wards at all. So all of the councillors were elected for at large. Have we looked at that?
So what he presented, just to clarify that, he suggested that you'd have one general ward and everyone would be elected from that general ward, because under legislation, if you establish a Māori ward, you must have a general ward. So it's not district-wide, but it's elected by everyone in the district.
I've used the wrong language. The idea is one
so
general
everyone's
ward
clear.
and one Māori ward.
Yes.
And every councillor is elected from one general ward.
Yes.
Have we looked at that as an option?
We haven't presented it as part of the slides because that has never been part of the discussions. During the last discussion around the representation arrangement, it was included in one of the slides as an alternative option as part of the submissions, but that was one voice out of all of the submitters, the 285 submitters. So that's not the majority view. However, it could be worked up and then presented in the report. In terms of population data and boundaries, it would be quite easy to do because the boundaries would align with the Kapiti Coast District Council boundaries. And the population data would also be quite easy to provide because it's one ward in essence. But we haven't heard it strongly enough from elected members for us to work it up as part of these slides.
So one might suggest that we haven't heard it from our public in terms of an option because it wasn't presented as one.
Well, we have heard it from one person of the public.
Yeah, who has experience in electoral cycle and that kind of thing. So
Just make the comment that this was considered in the previous representation review in that initial proposal stage. It was when councillors workshopped it. It was one of the top options. So if I recall correctly, councillors didn't end up proposing that as their initial proposal, but they almost did. So it was popular. Where we started as a project team is that we had some direction that we were looking at a streamlined approach, least change to the status quo. Moving to a district-wide approach would be quite a significant change from the status quo. But as Steffi has said, it would be easy for us to include that in the council report if you provide direction that is something you would like to do.
Can I also add, if we are including it, so there has been feedback from a member of the community who has experience in this area. As councillors, you also have to consider that this will then go through a submission process, and then at the other end, when you consider the final proposal, if at that point that is passed as the final proposal, is there then more likelihood that somebody will object to it because it is quite a big change from the status quo? And we've heard during the preliminary engagement that the community support the status quo to quite a big extent. So that's something that you'd have to consider. But if you provide a steer to include it, we will. Just wanted to have said that.
I can't speak for anyone else around the table, but I'd be interested in at least seeing it on there as an option.
Yeah, certainly as a discussion point. I'd also suggest that the people who ultimately make the decision, what they did last time with the options that council put up is, in fact, they decided that district-wide should be reduced and it would be more ward. So the orientation is away from districts into more localised wards. And unless there's been a philosophical change, and I don't believe there has been, that's probably not going to fly because it's kind of going in the opposite direction to which they're going. I think, and I don't want to debate it, but the primary case against going fully district wide is that it favoured people who had lots of money. So you have to run a campaign like a mayoral candidate. So you have to appeal to people in Paikokariki all the way through to Aotaki. And so if you weren't well resourced, it was really, really difficult. And so if you want to fill the council room with people who've got plenty, then that's one way of doing it. So there are equity issues around that as well. But yeah.
Yeah, it's all right. I've got them. That's cool. Thank you. I'd just comment that one of the things I have heard from our public is sometimes, and even a meeting just the other day, sometimes when we go out for consultation, we give them set boxes that gives them no room to think outside of those boxes. And so I guess the attraction for me of putting something that's completely outside the box is it opens the door for that conversation if the public wants to have it. If they don't, then they'll submit accordingly. And I would also just suggest, in terms of what Nigel said, I think saying that only the wealthy can get elected, this story in terms of district-wide, if you look at this current council sitting around the table, at least some of us district-wide didn't spend a huge amount of money to get elected district-wide.
We didn't have school principals.
So, I would say you just need to be known in your local community. But that's just my thoughts. Michael, online.
Sure, thank you, Deputy Chair. Can you hear me all right?
Certainly can.
Okay, look, sorry, I came into this a little bit late, and if you'll allow me just to make a quick comment on the prior discussion of the boundary between Otaki and Waikanae, is that okay?
Sure, love to hear from you.
Thank you, and I know you already talked about this, and I know Councillor Coe has talked about this, and as much as Richard Mansell and the Waikanae board love having Te Horo as part of their catchment, I think the primary concern, and I wasn't around during the debate when the representation review heard the council not wanting to move the boundary from Te Hapua Road. I think the primary concern in the community is that we're split. If you look right down the district, Te Horo is really the only community of a geographical nature that is chopped right down the middle, and that's more concern than if we belong, naturally to Otaki or naturally down to Waikanae. I think there's arguments both ways, and of course Te Horo has benefited greatly by accessing some good funding opportunities that they may not have got in Otaki. But that aside, having a boundary right down the centre line on School Road and Te Horo Beach Road is, I think, where the problem lies. So I think if that is addressed and still fits in that plus or minus view under the rules, then I think that would be a better outcome than it currently is. So that's just what I wanted to share with the meeting.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
I think that's noted. All right, Shelley.
Just in follow up to that, having lived in Otaki, my dad was from Te Horo. Actually, there's a lot of historical feeling in Te Horo that is Otaki bound, not Waikanae. And we've got to consider that. We do have a lot of new people in Te Horo, but there's also a lot of older families that have been there for a long time.
Thank you, Shelley. All right, Steffi.
The last thing I wanted to raise with the with councillors and elected members is around the community board appointments. During the last session, you signalled an interest in largely retaining the status quo in terms of appointments back to the community boards, but also exploring whether there was a way to utilise the Māori ward councillor to make the appointments more equitable and fair. To achieve this, what we have suggested on the screen is to appoint the Māori ward councillor in an and/or fashion to all of the community boards. And I just wanted to take a step back. What you have suggested, largely retaining the status quo, was also supported by the community, by the way. So by doing that, appointing the Māori ward councillor in an and/or fashion, that would then leave the council the flexibility to actually consider exact appointments when the new council is elected, rather than binding the new council by anything that is determined as part of the representation review. So what that would mean is that for each of the community boards, it would say the determined number of councillors. So for Waikanae, that would be 1 out of the 2 general ward councillors and or the Māori ward councillor. In terms of appointments.
Martin.
Yep. I just want to make sure that didn't get mixed up. Certainly, when I was talking to it, it was more just I'd heard conversation around there actually being a Māori community board as such. Now, it was made pretty clear that that's not a possibility through legislation. Different conversation. So with regards to appointing back a Māori ward councillor to all 5 community boards, I think that's pretty unreasonable. And the other side of it is also why wouldn't we be doing that with the district-wide councillors? Because they're district-wide as well. So one would potentially argue that they'll be the same. They should all be appointed back to all 5 community boards as well. And I don't think it's necessarily. I think you potentially have a person turning up to to community boards, but the general kaupapa is not going to be tied into the community boards necessarily. We've got our mana whenua for that potentially. But yeah, that's just my view.
Can I just clarify that for you as well? So with this appointment structure, what it will create is the opportunity for council, when the new council is elected, to then determine who is appointed back. So that doesn't mean that the Māori ward councillor will be appointed to all community boards. But there is the option. That is a high workload, as you say. But there is the option for that council then to have the flexibility to decide which community boards that councillor should be appointed to. So it could mean, and I think it was raised in relation specifically to the Paikakariki Raumati ward councillor sitting on 2 community boards, there could be an option to then, when the newly elected council is sworn in, to appoint the Māori ward councillor to Raumati and the general ward councillor to Paikakariki, and then just leave it at that, and everything else is as we currently know it in terms of appointment back. It doesn't mean that the Māori ward councillor must be appointed to all of them. That's what we were trying to
It's just
create,
opening up
the
the possibility.
flexibility. Yeah.
You don't have to decide which one they're appointed to.
So,
No.
parking that for a sec, which is great. Yep, got that. In relation to the, say, the councillors in Paraparaumu and Waikanae aren't put back to community boards. The current structure as it is, does it allow for the conversation of those being appointed back as part of the community board without voting rights? Or is that a decision that would be made at the delegation stage at the beginning of the triennium?
In terms of no voting rights, so they're not appointed back as members.
Well, they'd have to be appointed back as
I'm just trying to
Well,
clarify.
to be brutally
before I
honest,
answer.
the issue I've had with my community board
Yes.
is their non-recognition of me, which means I'm not getting emails, I'm not getting other bits and pieces and information generally about the ward I'm elected to represent. I'm not interested in having a vote at the table. That I get the balance of that, and I've got the right to speak at the table anyway. But it was contested quite heavily for about 18 months, which was very uncomfortable. I just wanted to make sure that there's a pathway for a decision to be made in that spot. So would it be at the beginning of the triennium with regards to not being as contestable as I found it coming into this triennium?
I will try to start answering that question and then possibly hand over to Dale or even Sarah. As part of the representation review, councillors will be setting who is appointable back to community boards as members, so they will have full voting rights. Under legislation, there is a, I think it says no more than half of the members, so councillors can't be more than half of the members. So appointing all 3 councillors, I know that's not what you're saying, but appointing all 3 councillors back would probably mean it's outside of that rule. But in terms of appointing back without voting rights, the representation structure doesn't really talk about that. So maybe Dale has something to add, or Sarah in terms of that. Yeah, Sarah.
Just what Steffi said is exactly right and correct in terms of the local electoral act as well. This was an issue that we grappled with when we received the Local Government Commission determination from the last representation review, and we queried this. They were really clear that if you know, in terms of members appointed, they do need to be part of the final structure, either as determined by council or as determined by the LGC to be a member. There wasn't any discretion. You know, I think we asked because there was appetite for that. Could we appoint all of them anyway? They said no, you can't do that. You'll have to alternate. So I guess I just make the point because it's important that that whatever council adopt is what you think you need within the perimeters of the legislation. Did you want to add anything to that, Dale? No.
So, I mean, we put it in as a delegated, part of our delegated authorities, which was fundamentally ignored. But that's really the only tool we've got. Yep, I just want clarity. I'm not disagreeing or agreeing with it. I'm just getting clarity on that. Lovely, thank you.
It does seem that the representation around the community board is probably one of the most internally contentious things that that councillors have. My personal view is that councillors shouldn't be on community boards at all. And if they're in the ward and they want to go, then great. But they shouldn't have voting rights because the community board is actually elected. People are elected specifically for a community board. You're not electing a councillor to be on the community board. Anyway, leaving that aside. But it's a bit concerning that you have three district-wide councillors who may not want to be on community boards, and God bless them for that, but maybe they do, but then they're denied the opportunity, where at the same time we've got an elected member who has to be on two, with the full responsibility of two community boards, and it just seems inequitable to do that. So is there a mechanism under the current structure that would allow for the appointment of a district-wide councillor to either one of the vacant community boards, given that there was an extra one thrown into the mix, and obviously they hadn't thought about this when they decided to create it. So if that's a possibility, and just in terms of ward councillors being able to attend but not having not having a lesser status, I guess, at the board itself, because that's a really contentious thing.
So the representation, the legislation around representation reviews and arrangements doesn't talk around the status of different councillors that aren't appointed. So that will have to be something that is discussed separately. In terms of district-wide councillors being appointed back, it's ward councillors that are appointed back because they represent the community. They represent those wards. So if district-wide councillors want to attend, they can do so. But they can't be appointed back as members.
Yeah. But I mean, there isn't actually a definition of a district-wide councillor and who they represent. The argument is they represent everybody. So therefore, Lawrence, for instance, represents the people of Otaki. He represents the people of Paika. He is every man. He is every man. Wonderful. Yep. So if given that he's this honourable.
I'm not sure how to take that.
No,
Councillor Wilson.
Take it well. It's meant in good spirit. So is this a legislative? My question here is this a legislative thing, or is this just something that we have some control over internally?
Yeah, it's legislative, so it's really clear that it's ward-based councillors that can be appointed back. And I think this is just an example of the legislation is really strict, and it doesn't permit every scenario. So we're working within that.
I promise. So if we stopped calling them district-wide councillors and called them general ward councillors, then that would change the deal. They would now be ward councillors.
So in terms of what ward would they belong to? Right. The general ward of Kapiti, but you already have wards, so that doesn't allow. I'm sure that's not possible.
But it's like a Maori ward as well. See, that's elected by everybody.
But you already have split up the general electoral population amongst wards already, so you can't then just put another ward
Hence
across
the argument.
all of it, hence district-wide.
Hence the argument to go for one general ward, full stop.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's it's good.
We'll have community boards, and then general ward councillors get, by delegation from within the whole council, get appointed back to whatever ward is suitable for their location. Saves all the argument. Anyway, Cam.
Yep. I would toko Councillor Wilson's comments about not having ward councillors on the community boards appointed back at all. I find it to be quite a weird power relationship. Like, no comment about Shelley, Councillor Warwick. We actually get on really, really well. But there's this whole chair of the board, and then you have the councillor who actually have the voting rights, but then the chair of the board is actually technically the boss of when they're on the community board, and it's just a slightly weird relationship. It would just be a lot clearer if the community board operated by itself, but had a really good relationship with their ward councillors. And, rather than having, the only disadvantage is the community board then only has 4 members, and then you can have a hung vote, which is not ideal.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Okay, I think we're probably getting out of scope of the review here. We're talking about internal governance structure and our delegations within internally from council to who gets delegated
So that's
where in
not
terms
counted
of
as
that.
part of the representation review?
No, it's
to
not part of the rep
appoint or not?
review.
That's cool.
Rob,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. Sorry for getting out of scope here, but if you have a scenario with a community board and the chair and the ward councillor, and there's an arrangement, if there's a floating district-wide councillor who lives close by, there could be an arrangement with the ward councillor and the floating one to perhaps take each other's place, even if it's okay with the rest of the community board. With the chair,
I think again it's a
can that work?
conversation. It's a conversation that probably needs to be held internally with the mayor part of that conversation, because the whole way that we've structured this time has been related to our delegations that were set up at the beginning of this triennium.
Right.
Could I comment on that, please? In terms of the membership, that isn't possible, because it's only the ward councillor that is appointable back to the community board. So it would be possible for the Waikanae Community Board for the councillors to take turns, but that would have to be through council making a decision halfway through to appoint the other one back to the community board instead. With district-wide councillors, that's not an option. So you're always able to join the meeting. It's a public meeting, but you wouldn't be a member and you wouldn't have voting rights.
Well, that clarifies that, and I'll just stay a floater.
Cool. Okay, we can move on.
Covered. So in terms of next steps, there will be a report that will be brought to the council meeting of the 25th of August as requested by councillors last time we did a briefing, a public briefing. You requested that it was pushed back a little bit to allow for the bill to get to close to enactment as possible. So we've set the 25th council meeting, which is the council meeting just before that due date, as the date to bring the report to. Once council has resolved its initial representation proposal, it will then start a formal submissions process. And this process is heavily prescribed in legislation. There are clear timeframes that will have to be met within legislation. There will be briefings and a submission hearing as well, planned for September and October 2024. And another report will be brought to council on the 31st of October, which is just before the due date of 3rd of November 2024 for the final proposal to be passed by council. And both the initial proposal and the final proposal will be publicly notified as per the Act. I also thought it was important to mention here that once council makes an initial proposal decision, any of the submissions received during the engagement period, you will only be able to change your initial proposal based on those submissions. So you will no longer be able to just set a new arrangement structure for the final proposal. And also, if no submissions are received, your initial proposal becomes your final proposal as well. So just so you're aware before you make a decision on the 25th of July that that's prescribed in the Act. And also, if the final proposal doesn't meet the fair representation rule under the Act, then it will have to be referred to the Local Government Commission. And if any objections or appeals are received as well by the community, it will also be passed on to the Local Government Commission for final determination. And they will then make a decision by April 2025, just ahead of the next local body election. Yeah.
So the rescinding idea sits completely outside that?
So what I've just summarised is the current Act. Yes, it does sit a little bit outside of that. And I don't have a slide. I apologise, because the bill was only introduced into the House yesterday. So I can talk to this slide a little bit. In terms of the rescinding option, once the bill's enacted, which is expected by the end of July, Council will have two options. Option one we discussed when Councillor Coe asked the question. So council could either decide to just continue and then meet those timeframes I've just outlined. That's under the current act. Those timeframes will stay the same for those councils that decide to continue with the establishment of a Māori ward. If that's the case, then council will have to hold a poll at the 2025 local government election to determine the outcome of or the future of the Māori ward. The other option is option 2, and that's the rescinding option. So the bill is, once enacted, there will be a window where council can rescind its decision to establish the Māori ward, and that will be the day after Royal Assent, which is the day we don't really know yet, up to the 6th of September. So in that window, council will have the option to rescind. If council decides to rescind its decision, it will then have 2 options in terms of representation arrangements. It can either, and we are one of those councils that are able to do that, it can revert back to the existing arrangements, so the arrangements that were in place for the 2022 local body elections. And then council, if council decides to do that, council would have to do another representation review in 2027, because that would be the 6-yearly cycle. The other option is for council to do a shortened representation review without considering the Māori ward in the mix. And if council decides to do that, there are certain timeframes that are a little bit truncated. They mirror what I've outlined before, but there's just a little bit truncated. So for example, the initial proposal would have to be passed by the 13th of September, and then it will kick off a submission period for 3 weeks, I believe, after that. And if council does that, then council wouldn't have to do a representation review until 3030. It's a lot of data without a slide, I apologise, and I can put that in an email just to summarise it for everyone.
So you either rescind and drop everything, or rescind and keep going with Te Horo, Emerald Glen, or just keep going. Don't rescind and just keep going with everything.
Yes, that's right, yes.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I just wanted to get that clarified as well. So it's on the assumption that we don't want to appear like we have zero courage, and so we're obviously not going to rescind that. So are you suggesting that one where we just take that's a given, and then you just you have a truncated consultation on the other stuff?
Sorry, can you say that again? Sorry.
Okay, so,
Yep.
Without the commentary this time.
Yeah.
So, assuming that we're just, we're not going to rescind the decision to have a Māori ward, that decision's been made, locked and loaded, so the truncated process would be on the other stuff.
The truncated representation review only comes into play if you rescind. It doesn't even come into, if you don't rescind, you just have to meet the, we are continuing as we are to the timeframes we've set out, and council will have to pass its final proposal by the 3rd of November.
Given that if you don't rescind and you're continuing with the Māori ward, then that becomes something that is appealable?
So any of the decisions, any of the final proposals passed by councils under legislation, there can be an appeal or an objection lodged, and then it goes to the local government commission. Even with the shortened representation review, that remains. So,
So, Councillor Wilson's, sticking with his guns is all it takes is one person to send it to appeal. And they'll decide, and they may look at the current legislation and decide that no Māori councillor is worthwhile.
So in terms of, sorry, there's a separate discussion going on. Dale, would you like to say it into the mic so everyone can hear?
You can't appeal the principle of Māori wards. The council's already made that decision, and it's proceeding, and there is, under the Formula 1, Māori ward councillor, so that's not appealable. And if there were two or more and you had more than one Māori ward, that could come under an objection of where that boundary may be. But the actual principle, you can't appeal.
So
So-
the community would have an opportunity to have their say at the poll.
Yep, so you'd end up with a Maori ward for the next triennium, and then a poll that would suggest that they may or may not last beyond then.
Correct.
And unless we have a change of government and they repeal.
The repeal. That could be quite repealing. Sorry, this is terrible. It is that one. That's right. How are we going, Steffi, with the slides?
That was the end of the slides. So if you
That's
had
the
any more
end.
questions.
Any other questions? Right, I think there's a lot in that for us to consider. Thank you for the presentation, Steffi. It's very complicated. I know there's a lot of people in our community that are very interested in this this process, so it'll be good just to keep following this space. So we're finished on this particular briefing. We've got another one at 2:30, so you've got a break for about 12 minutes. Thank you, Dale and Ben, for attending and joining us for this.